Good afternoon. I just want to thank Janice, who is one of my heroes, for chairing the session. And what's happening there? What's that? All right. You keep talking. All right. And I just want to say I'm very excited to be at this conference, to be part of this conference, and I think it's an extremely exciting time to be a feminist art historian in Canada. This paper will touch on addiction and temperance, absence and presence, names and namelessness, perfection and imperfection. The objects of analysis are textile banners made by and for Canadian members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. 21 extant banners were exhibited in 1999 and 2000 at the Textile Museum of Canada in Toronto and the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. The banners are now in the permanent collection of the CMC. The exhibition, titled Gather Beneath the Banner, was the first time that WCTU banners had been exhibited as cultural artifacts in Canada. I viewed these banners in situ recently, and the experience crystallized for me two interrelated issues that I would like to focus on today. First, the absence of signatures on the banners, meaning that the female producers will remain anonymous, that is, nameless, in histories written about the textiles. And second, that in studying the WCTU banners, a methodology is needed that does not privilege the named artist. As I will argue, imperfections, quote unquote, in these banners function as their female makers' signatures, that is, as material traces of women's touch, whereas the so-called perfection, quote unquote, of some of the banners in the CMC's collection erase female creative production in that the perfection or lack of flaws has been interpreted as machine-made, ready-made rather than homemade, which would suggest that the banners were produced by regalia companies owned and operated by men. This is a couple pages from a catalog of banners for the Dominion Regalia Company of Toronto. And this is from the Glenbow Archives in Calgary. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in the United States in 1873 by Frances E. Willard. The first Canadian chapter of the WCTU was formed in Picton, Ontario by Letitia Youmans in October 1874, and the Dominion WCTU, later the Canadian WCTU, was founded in Montreal in October 1883. Sharon Cook has described the WCTU's brand of activism as evangelical feminism. In addition to temperance and prohibition, they promoted Protestant middle-class values such as work, sobriety, thrift, duty, and the sanctity of family life. Theirs was a quote-unquote maternal feminism based on the belief that women were by nature nurturers who must take responsibility for society's well-being. Many of the members also actively advocated for women's suffrage, which explains in part why the WCTU adopted banners as their primary ritualistic object. As feminist scholars Rosika Parker and Lisa Tickner have shown, among others, British suffragettes employed banners to great dramatic, aesthetic, and political effect. As Parker remarks in The Subversive Stitch, quote, the tradition of banner-carrying demonstrations had grown up with the trades union movement from the 1830s. Union banners were an obvious source of inspiration for the feminists. They adopted the same format of pictorial messages combined with a slogan, end quote. Female temperance advocates also employed this aesthetic strategy, the use of both pictorial elements and slogans, as these banners demonstrate. Parker also notes that whereas the majority of British trade union banners were machine-made by George Tuthill's banner-making business, suffrage banners were more often made by suffragettes themselves, and were therefore more eclectic due to their producers' varying aesthetic interests and levels of skill. Quote, suffrage banners daringly combined embroidery, paint, collage, and raised work in original and equally well-finished products. Their effective use of mixed media was perhaps a result of the middle-class woman's lack of professionalism, a positive outcome of accomplishment, end quote. This insight is important for the WCTU banners because they too combine a variety of visual strategies, approaches, and skill sets. Parker's allusion to middle-class women's accomplishment refers to the history of women in amateur rather than professional, quote-unquote, embroidery. As Christina Huneau demonstrates in the introduction to the new collection of essays, Rethinking Professionalism, the privileging of professionals and professionalization in art history and craft studies has functioned to erase certain groups and individuals from the histories of art and craft. By recognizing and celebrating the aesthetic eclecticism that resulted from suffragettes' lack of professionalization in textile work, Parker flips the amateur-professional binary on its head. This accomplishment in embroidery and lack of professionalization would have also been the status quo for the middle-class Canadian members of the WCTU, who would have learned to embroider as young girls. Yet, like their British suffragette counterparts, their skills in embroidery would have varied, and as I will argue in this paper, it is the flaws or mistakes in the Temperance banners that signify women's creative work, thus, paradoxically, making so-called imperfect craft objects of greater interest to the feminist craft historian, or at least to me. This brings me to the WCTU banners themselves and to their stories so far. In 1984, significantly the same year that Parker's important book, The Subversive Stitch, was originally published, archivist Wendy Harker was painstakingly working her way through the WCTU headquarters on Yonge Street in Toronto. Among other things, she discovered 21 cloth banners, quote, rolled up in nondescript brown paper in the bottom drawer of a cabinet stuffed with documents, end quote. This unceremonious storage of the banners reveals the extent to which they had lost their ritualistic power since the days of active temperance promotion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Although Prohibition did occur for a few short years in Canada in the early 20th century, it was quickly revoked, and while there are still chapters of the WCTU worldwide, including in Canada, advocacy of complete abstinence from alcohol had petered out by the 1930s. The banners themselves had been at the center of the temperance movement in Canada and internationally. Banners were carried in parades and used as decoration at national and international WCTU conventions. This is a photo from the World's Convention of 1903 in Geneva. In 1899, Honorary Secretary of the World's WCTU, Agnes E. Slack, remarked in an article about the upcoming Paris Exposition, quote, please, every WCTU at once bring before the members the importance of sending contributions of money or literature, banners, and photographs for our kiosk, end quote. Although intrigued by the banners, Harker was unable to pursue their study until 1997, at which point they were brought to the then-named Museum for Textiles, where conservator Margaret Ballantyne began to restore them. They were exhibited at the Museum for Textiles in 1999 and subsequently at the Canadian Museum of Civilization from 2000 until 2001. In 2002, textile curator Tina Bates began the process of acquiring the banners from the WCTU for the CMC's permanent collection. I met with Ms. Bates last October when I went to the CMC to view the banners. One of the things she emphasized in our discussion was her belief that most of the banners were probably machine-made and therefore made by men. She pointed, for example, to a banner with an image of an anchor, suggesting that it had been made by a professional sign painter and not by a member of the WCTU. However, she directed my attention to another banner, made for the Mount Forest WCTU, and suggested that it was homemade, based on the fact that the O's are different and irregular. You see that more clearly when it's in person. At the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, there are 3 other WCTU banners, none of which appeared in the Gather Beneath the Banner exhibition or exhibition catalog. At the Glenbow, I met with Senior Curator of Cultural History Lorraine Lounsbury, who also highlighted the flaws in the banners, thereby suggesting that they were the work of female amateur creators rather than male professionals. For example, the red banner had experienced slumping, meaning that the front materials were sagging because the front and back had not been lined up perfectly, and the front had stretched at a different rate than the back. The green banner I'm really good at titles, as you can tell. The green banner had experienced lifting and cracking of the paint, which is typical for this kind of textile over time. This had also been a problem for many of the banners of the CMC due to the lack of conservation prior to 1997. The Glenbow's third and final banner is the most interesting for my purposes here, because it can be linked to the Mount Forest banner in the CMC's collection that has irregular lettering. The maker of this banner, according to Miss Lounsbury, employed the so-called lazy stitch, appropriately named because it was one of the easiest and fastest methods of stitching. Ms. Lounsbury also noted that the type of gold-wrapped thread that was used could be bought at Eaton's, indicating that a WCTU member could have easily purchased the banner materials herself. Furthermore, and more to the point, the lettering on this banner is irregular. Some of the letters in Temperance are a bit squished. The N, for example, again, easier to see when it's in person. And the A's in Alberta are slightly different shapes. Let us leave this for the moment and turn to one of the banners in the CMC's collection, which is noteworthy because it is the only banner of the 21 in the CMC's collection that has a signature. I do not have a detail. You're going to have to believe me. This banner, made for the Western Union chapter of the WCTU in Toronto, has a beige satin background with gilt lettering outlined in gray-blue. On the banner is a painted Bible open to Psalm 23, a painted bouquet of violet asters, and the year 1894. Inscribed in tiny letters along one of the leaves, not going to be, but on the right, one of the middle leaves there, on one of the leaves of the bouquet is the name F.N. Stevenson, and another date, 1920, which indicates that the banner was likely made in 1920, and that the 1894 commemorates the year that the Western Union chapter was founded. Ms. Bates suggested that the signature might have belonged, or probably belonged, to a male painter or designer, because she noted women were disinclined to paint flowers onto banners. However, I find this unlikely, considering the fact that flower painting had become a common genre for women artists by the 18th century, if not before. Furthermore, in her book, The Spectacle of Difference, Lisa Tickner briefly mentions a homemade suffrage banner with a painted bouquet of flowers along with the name Mary Roser, R.A., Moser being alongside Angelica Kaufman, one of the two female founding members of the British Royal Academy in 1768. I believe it is possible that a woman painted the bouquet of flowers on the Western Union banner and that F.N. Stevenson was in fact a woman. However, in my research at the Archives of Ontario, where the Ontario WCTU font are now held, I did not find one name attributed to a female producer of Temperance banners, only the names of people who gave the banners as prizes at conventions or individuals who were in some way responsible for conserving them. But my desire to find specific names and signatures is the result of an art historical background, which I do not regret for a moment. Why do I have this impulse to find the names of the women who created the banners? What do I miss when I am searching for names and signatures? This is not to say that names are not important to the study of women artists. They can be extremely important, as demonstrated by Sherry Farrell-Rassette's beautifully written chapter on Aboriginal women artists in rethinking professionalism. Textile scholars, both feminist and otherwise, frequently note that the makers of textiles are often anonymous and therefore remain nameless in the histories of art and craft. Virginia Gardner-Troy, for example, has observed that, quote, "From ancient times to the present, textiles have been inextricably associated with women's work, the minor arts, quote unquote, the domestic environment, and a kind of anonymous amateur production." And I would just note that, of course, the gendering of textile work as feminine was really naturalized in the 18th and 19th centuries and was not limited to female producers necessarily from the ancient times forward. And in the catalog for Gather Beneath the Banner, founding curator founding curator of the Museum for Textiles, now the Textile Museum of Canada, Max Allen comments, quote, textile scholars, unlike art historians, often cannot find out exactly who made a particular piece of weaving or embroidery, adding that some of the WCTU banners are, quote, extraordinarily striking visually, but we have no idea who made them. Somebody knew once, of course, but the information was not thought important enough to attach to the banners themselves. Several are clearly homemade, while others must have been the work of professionals. He does not gender those terms. End quote. Returning to the so-called irregularities of the WCTU banners that potentially reveal their homemadeness, I would propose that these flaws, these ostensible imperfections, are the signs of women's craft work, or if you prefer, women's signatures, in lieu of textual names. They are corporeal signatures, reminding us of the importance of touch in both the use of textiles and the study of textiles. The methodology of privileging touch rather than vision in the study of material culture is not new, but I believe it bears highlighting within this context. Members of the WCTU made banners, carried them, held them, and took care of them, for a time at least. The women who handled the banners were also doing creative work. They created the contexts and spatial environments for the banners and gave them meaning. Only when this meaning had evaporated could the banners be stuffed so casually into a bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. Names are important for women's lives and women's art histories. But this privileging of names can have the paradoxical effect of disempowering women when their names are erased, taken away, or given away by choice, for example, when a woman changes her name upon marriage. So while I recognize the importance of names and naming for women, I also recognize the potential powerlessness inherent in bestowing too much significance on names and signatures in the study of women artists and producers of material culture. Susan Stewart observes in On Longing, quote, writing contaminates. Writing leaves its trace, a trace beyond the life of the body. Thus, while speech gains authenticity, writing promises immorality, or at least the immorality of the material world in contrast to the mortality of the body, end quote. British suffragettes who were imprisoned and force-fed knew this when they embroidered handkerchiefs with their signatures. As Parker comments, quote, the delicate embroidery declared that the supposed weaker sex was being subjugated to the torture of force-feeding and resisting. They signed their names in the very medium which was considered proof of their frailty and justification for their subjugation, end quote. But what to do when textiles betray no names and no signatures? I propose that there is historical, methodological, even personal, and perhaps even political value in imperfection. Imperfection in the context of the WCTU banners signals women's work, presence, and touch. As a recovering perfectionist myself, this realization gave me pause. In her book, Addiction to Perfection, Jungian analyst Marion Woodman observes, referring specifically to women, end quote, quote, driven to do our best at school, on the job, and in our relationships, in every corner of our lives, we try to make ourselves into works of art. Working so hard to create our own perfection, we forget that we are human beings, end quote. There is the potential for personal transformation when one lets go even a little of perfection as the ideal, and instead chooses to reflect upon, savor, even celebrate imperfection in one's own life and work. This is not to promote laziness in grammar, research, or writing. Rather, it is a meditation on what it might mean to leave a mark that says, I did not waste my life striving for some unattainable Sisyphean goal of perfection. Members of the WCTU were no doubt aiming for symmetry, regularity, and perfection in their banners. But in studying their banners, and specifically in thinking about names, signatures, and anonymity in the context of Canadian women producers of material culture, I find myself meditating on what is at stake for me personally with regards to the dichotomy of perfection and imperfection, both in my life and my work. And this is, at least in part, why I will continue to research and write about Canadian women artists, and indeed about women and art more generally. As far away, temporally and culturally, as those women may be from my own life, In writing about them, I am forced again and again to look at my own way of being in the world, and I find myself motivated to live as bravely as I can, knowing that imperfections are inevitable, but that those are the threads that will, if I let them, make my life all the richer. Thank you.